Welcome to Human-Machine Relations. This is the podcast that explores how people and technology are shaping the future of work, creativity, and communication. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Elif Güvençer. She is a communications strategist with more than 16 years of experience spanning agency, in-house, and advisory roles across corporate reputation and strategic communications. Elif is also the author of The Two Clocks, a framework for communications in the age of AI, which argues that AI is not simply changing how communications functions operate, but fundamentally reshaping what they need to become. In this episode of Human-Machine Relations, we'll be looking for the first time at a practical framework for how AI is implemented and understand why leaders need to think beyond mere productivity gains when doing so. This should be a really interesting episode. So welcome, Elif. I'm really happy to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I think about our relationship as humans with machines probably an unreasonable amount of time. So I'm really happy to be able to talk officially about it.
Excellent. So first of all, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career background?
Of course. So I suppose my career track allowed me to see communications from all the different possible angles. So I started out in agencies, Ogilvy and Edelman, where I worked on global communication campaigns for brands. And then I moved in-house to a big food conglomerate. And I was closely involved in their M&A agenda, but most importantly, the process where they have consolidated all of their snacking businesses only to create a multi-billion snacking business called Platis. So I was responsible for the launch of the company, creation of the corporate communications function ground up. And I have, after that, moved to data-driven advisory. So I'm now with a company called RepTrack, and they are a reputation intelligence company. So I work with communication officers and the board on stakeholder trust, reputation, and risk. So I guess that kind of unique portfolio of experience allows me to have the altitude needed to look at what AI brings, but also what AI takes away when it comes to communications.
Yeah, and most conversations about AI and communications focus at the moment on productivity, content creation, and efficiency. So what made you feel that there was a bigger, more fundamental question that the PR profession wasn't asking?
So all of that tactical conversation is necessary. It's just not sufficient as a primary response because I think it misses what AI is strategically changing for communications. And the first part is, first of all, persuasion no longer starts from a blank page. It starts from a machine-made baseline. And let me give you an example. So imagine, for example, you're going to buy, I don't know, maybe like a car or a TV. You go to ChatGPT and you're like, okay, which vendors should I consider? Give me a list. And the system would return you a short list. And in my view, that becomes two things. First of all, it is now a commercial gate that depends and decides whether an organization has made the cut. And we know there's increasing evidence, especially for B2B markets, that vendor discovery starts with AI and is a massive purchase intent driver. So you have that commercial impact. And secondly, that becomes a reputational shorthand that starts to influence stakeholder opinion before you as a company have opened your mouth. So any conversation you're about to have, there's a good chance AI got that first. And when you think about communications influence model, which is highly relational, that doesn't work when you have a synthetic intermediary that's now mediating all of your other stakeholders. Reputation management becomes architectural. So that's kind of, I think, the first massive tectonic, if I might say, change on how reputation is built. So I always joke saying reputation is now actually built a token at a time. So that's kind of the building part. When we look the other side of the coin that we don't want to look, which is how you lose reputation, when you think about crisis, for example, someone probably has made a decision in a particular context and communication can work backwards from that. AI changes that. Increasingly, you have a reputation risk that is generated from within the system, meaning like a hijacked prompt, hallucination, where you cannot reconstruct that, at least not fast enough to intervene. And when you think about that, the existing reputation management, risk management muscle, the function have all the playbooks are not sufficient. So in my view, those are massive tectonic changes. So any AI adoption needs to, I think, take a step back and look at that landscape strategically and plan accordingly.
And I mean, you talk about how this is a structural shift. So AI is not just changing how communications operates, but what the function itself needs to become and do for an organization. What does that look like in practice?
So most communication functions, in my view, are going to use AI to do the same thing, only faster. That's not a redesign. I think looking at all those tectonic changes we discussed, the first step should be setting your strategic intent. And in practical terms, it's basically putting pen to paper and answering the question of, okay, what does my function exist in this AI mediated world to do? And let that entire redesign be shaped by that intent. And the principle is not what to automate. The principle should be regaining, reclaiming bandwidth that was massively lost, especially with the last digital transformation of fragmented media and stakeholder landscape, always on necessities and risks. Reclaiming bandwidth and redeploying it strategically, that should be the designing principle. So efficiency is not the goal, it's the byproduct. And through that lens, basically what you need to be doing is looking at your entire operation. That includes the resource and activity and time allocation to figure out what you continue, start, stop doing. That also extends to the partners you work with, the type of external support you need. So that would essentially be the redesign exercise that needs to happen before you consider how you are actually operationalizing that intent.
And in terms of working with leadership teams throughout your career, you've worked very closely with a lot of leadership teams. So, in your view, what role does communications play that other functions in an organization can't easily match when it comes to advising leaders?
So I always call the communication function the organization slow thinker. So that comes from thinking fast and slow, Daniel Kahneman. And we have, according to him, two types of thinking. So you have the fast thinking, which is mostly subconscious. It's really fast. It takes over in a crisis. It's like our monkey brain. And then you have the slow thinking, which is the governance committee here that is slowing things down and allowing you to take in the broader landscape and make sense of things. So I think that's what communication brings uniquely to an organization. And when you think about how much AI accelerated our lives, I think that scarce capacity is very valuable, and communication is designed to bring it by capacity, by training. So that would be, I think, the first thing that is unique to comms. And the second one is also related. It's the only function who's able to see the trust consequence of a decision that looks fine from every single direction, because we well know very well that compliance is not the same discipline as reputation management. You can be perfectly compliant and have yourself a massive reputation issue. I mean, it's enough to look at the headlines right now when it comes to AI adoption, AI related restructuring. All of them, when you think about it, are reputation events. So I think in this era, communication professionals are needed a lot more, not less.
Yeah, definitely. And for anyone who hasn't come across the two clocks framework yet, can you explain the basics? What's the concept of the two clocks in simple terms?
So the two clocks framework rests on a very simple principle. In my view, communications functions are running two clocks. You have, first of all, the immediate clock that's outwards facing. That's basically operational demands of content creation, media monitoring, reputation management in an AI mediated world. That's urgent, that's legitimate, and it's going to eat up every single hour you have if you allow it, including the ones you get by AI automating tasks. Then you have the structural clock, which is, if you think about it, that slow thinking applied to the function itself. It's inward, it's about figuring out what it is that you have to become so you can assume the role that is required of a communication function in today's era. And that gets no external pressure, and it is my assumption that most functions are going to prioritize the immediate clock at the expense of the structural one. But this is precisely where the risk begins, and you are at the beginning of a long track that might actually take you to a executional function. So the framework basically goes through 5 dimensions across both two clocks, because in my view you have to work two clocks or neither works. Because if you only focus on the immediate day to day, you are going to end up with territory you can't really occupy because you haven't redesigned yourself. Or if you only focus inward about what you need to become, by the time you're done, the world around you has already changed.
Yeah, definitely. And why do you think it is that so many organizations are focused on only one on the immediate aspect? So, or I mean, it could be that they focus on the structural and not the immediate as well, but I think that would be less likely probably.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I'd say probably most functions are focused on the immediate day-to-day, how do I manage my reputation in today's era? And I'd say that's not an irrational response. That's actually perfectly in line with the incentive structures. When you think about it, this is where your CEO is watching, where there's an actual visible reputation risk, where your credentials are being built, but that's also self-defeating. So that's kind of, first of all, I think it's the inclination, that gravitational pull is because of the incentive structure, but also I think underneath it there's another layer which I suspect is psychological, because both of these clocks require the leaders to be vulnerable simultaneously in two different directions. So the immediate clock, the reputation management in this era, means you have to show up as a technology and risk thinker, and you can apply that thinking not just to people but machines, and that's a profile that many have not embodied yet. And the other structural clock basically means having a hard, honest look at your value proposition, dismantle it visibly under scrutiny and create a new one. And the first one, meaning growing into a strategic technology and risk thinker, that's a socially acceptable role. And that's what we hear from a lot of the communication functions, as in, they're doing experiments, they're learning what to do. AI is new for everyone, so that's a more socially acceptable one. And I believe that's why the leaders, most of them at least, are going to choose that vulnerability they can live with and defer the structural discussion until, in my view, it's too late, because that doesn't come with a big bang. It comes gradually and in subtle ways. Maybe, for example, the way I think it would land in the day of a CCO would be like, for example, in your organization, an AI board committee has been formed and you only find out about it after the first meeting. Or there is a paper on AI risk that went through maybe IT, chief AI officer, legal, and that reached the board without communication input, not because anyone meant anything, but nobody thought to ask. So when you think about it, none of them are crisis, but they're step-by-step a road, one invitation missed at a time, that makes this function an executional one.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as well, there's probably a lot of downward pressure from leadership on the comms team to sort of like, oh, just do what we tell you as well. And sometimes it's hard to push back against that, isn't it?
Definitely. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with how the function is viewed by the management. If you're viewed as a function that is only here, that is called in when there is an issue to clean it up, or you're there to communicate decisions that's been already made, I think that's a more difficult battle. And I hear from communication functions that are having discussions with leaders that are asking, can we replace so-and-so tasks with AI? How can we get efficiency? So there is, I think, massive pressure that's also pushing leaders to focus more on the immediate one.
And one of the ideas that I found interesting is your challenge to the PR professions, what you call production identity. So you're suggesting that AI is exposing whether comms is truly influencing decisions or simply producing outputs. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
So I believe the communication function carries an inherent production identity. So it's a value proposition built on the volume and the quality of what the function produces. So obviously not every single function sits in it equally, but I think the gravitational pull is real for any person that does communication. And I think in the absence of an actual mechanism where you can tie your communication to the impact it has driven, especially in commercial sense, the output volume became a proxy for value for this function. And I think the sequence of events are not complicated. In the absence of something that demonstrates your concrete value, I think you automatically are leaning into a production identity. And I think some of that the example that always frustrated me when I got communication, and I think it shows that measurement gap in its purest form, is crisis prevention. So sometimes your job is to make sure nothing happens. You're trying to prevent a story from breaking, and you reach that KPI, which is 0, and you go into your CEO's office, you have nothing to show for because the lack of something has no natural metrics. So I think there is an inherent challenge in measuring your added value, because obviously your added value was never production. It's sense making, it's second order risk thinking, bringing the voices of the stakeholders that are not in the room, but that was always difficult to measure. And right now, I think AI is exposing that, because AI is not a productivity layer, it's an essentially a structural stress test. It basically exposes whether your value proposition is upstream, meaning you're shaping decisions, you're mapping risks, creating signals, or you have basically mistaken yourself for a sophisticated production mechanism instead of providing strategic influence. So I think this is where we are in that chain. And this is not all doom and gloom. I think the same technology is also allowing leaders to draw a more direct line between what they do and what the impact of that is. I think the good first step is the AI visibility piece. We know that is driving what AI engines say about a company. We know that's a purchase intent driver. So any intervention you had can show up in there, and you can tie it to a commercial outcome. That's the first. But I think the bigger picture that organizations and communication leaders need to focus on is establishing that infrastructure of attribution, meaning this particular communication activity caused that particular commercial outcome. And that basically allows communication to have conversations about its value with the management in a lot different ways than it was possible before.
Yeah, and it's easier for agencies to fall into that production identity trap as well, isn't it? Because it's kind of more of a transactional relationship in a way.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say the two clocks are ticking for agency side as well, and for the agency side faster, because if you're an in-house team, you obviously have already proven your credentials to a certain degree beyond production. I'm sure you prevented at least one crisis, you have provided an important stakeholder view in an important setting, so you have more, I think, money in the bank to spend. But if you're an agency, you productize basically that entire production, and you might be the first one on the chopping block when it comes to cutting budgets. So I think that causal measurement piece is very important for agencies who are selling time. I think the first thing should be, okay, exactly the same exercise. What portion of my value proposition is based on outputs? How can I make it upstream? And also we see from a lot of I guess consultancies moving to a gain share model. So the McKinseys of the world are kind of talking about that gain share, which is certain part of your compensation is paid upfront. The other one is tied to actual outcomes, whether it's cost saving or bottom line impact. So for communication, the instinct is right, but there's a glitch. You can only gain share what you can measure. And right now we measure outputs that AI is automating. So that attribution infrastructure, that causal proof of this is what I have done in terms of communication, and this is the exact impact it caused. I think whoever brings that to the table will be able to redesign its value proposition and price accordingly on the agency side.
Yeah. And you've identified 3 new capabilities as well that communications teams will need to survive in this new age: AI literacy, reputational risk architecture, and coherent judgment. So which of these do you think PR teams or comms professionals are most in need of strengthening?
I would say the coherence judgment. Remember at the beginning, we talked about that reputational shorthand that AI provides. That shorthand has no natural owner because it's not created by one function. So you have marketing who governs brand, you have corp comms who governs executive voice, media relations, own channels, you have investor relations who manages the investor narrative. all of those functions do their own work on their own surface to their own stakeholder logic. What nobody does is reading the whole. What does the total picture say? And that was, I say, manageable before because nobody read the whole. But AI is changing that. Now you have an intermediary capable of reading that whole and redistributing what it finds at scale. So there is a massive governance gap when it comes to that reputational shorthand, and it's one that communications coherence judgment needs to apply. And we talked about how reputation management is now architectural. I think the required task is what I call signal architecture, meaning looking at all the surfaces AI ingests and figuring out whether it tells one story or many, and convening that cross-functional committee when the picture doesn't hold.
And job roles and titles in communications might change to reflect this, right?
Definitely. So for example, one of the ones that I really am passionate about is the agent briefer. So right now, the majority of the focus is on impacting what an AI engine says about a company because there is another human at the end of the line. But soon we're going to be going into agent to agent. The agentic era, I think, comes with its own risks. So one of my arguments is that imagine the new failure mode for me is agentic cacophony. Basically, imagine departments, many of them launching many external facing agents. Those become essentially your operational spokespeople, but they're not briefed as such. Yes, obviously, when they get configured, there's an IT and compliance, that operational protocol is there, but reputational protocol is hardly missing. You know, what is the corporate agent's brand voice? What are the no-go zones? What are the topics it should not be breaching, but also what are the topics it needs more nuance? A well-configured agent can say, I can't answer that topic if it breaches its parameters. But what happens if someone asks, for example, oh, I hear your CEO has been slapped with an embezzlement case. What's that about? There is an opportunity for you to correct the story because that person might not ask anyone else. And that I think particularly is a communication discipline, briefing the agents. And also when you think about it, you would never put a spokesperson in front of media before media training, asking those hard questions. So before an agent go live, obviously security questions are currently asked, but those reputationally sensitive questions are not. So that is another one in itself, for example, which is a pure comms role.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of very sensitive issues that agents might come across, and it's going to be, a real weak point of how they respond to the external world. I came across an example a while back where they were using agents to maybe to do outreach for events and things like that, and inviting someone responded to the agent, obviously not knowing it was an agent, and saying that, oh, I can't come because somebody close, a spouse has died or something, I have time off. How an agent will respond will set the tone for how the reputation of that company is perceived ultimately, and it cannot afford to get something like that wrong, right?
Yeah, precisely. And it goes beyond basic or main security or operational procedures. This is a purely comms role because they are speaking on behalf of the company. And we see as far as the regulation goes, organizations are going to be held accountable for what their agents are saying. Deploy the system, either rule-based or generative. You're responsible for what it says as well. So I agree with you.
Yeah. One of the things that you push for is that comms should play a much bigger role in AI governance because it's the only function that is focused on organizational coherence rather than a single business objective. Why do you think that communications is often absent from AI governance conversations today? And I know you mentioned sometimes, and we often have this conversation as well about why isn't comms at the table? Should comms have a seat at the table, et cetera, et cetera? So I think that was always an issue even before all of this. So how can we, as the comms practitioners, try to get into those conversations? And as you said before, it's probably not intentional, but it does happen, and we're often the last ones to know what's happening.
Yeah, I think two reasons. In terms of AI, first of all, AI is being seen as a technology project, whereas in my view, it's a reputation project with many ins and outs. So I think the first reason is the way organizations box it. And that's why it sits with the technical leaders, like chief AI officer roles, for example, is quite visible in big enterprises, and its mandate is expanding now beyond technical leadership into change management, organizational design, and around them you have a core set of disciplines. You have IT, you have legal, compliance, HR increasingly, because of employee adoption, and communications is missing from that table. So I think, first of all, that's the setup. But second one, I dare say it's a hangover from that production identity. If you're being viewed as someone who is responsible for producing content, someone who's responsible for communicating decisions after they're being made, you're never going to be called into when the decision gets made. So I think that's the reasons why comms is absent from that. The way to fix it is, I'd say, is asserting the unique value that communication can bring to the AI governance discussion. First of all, you did mention that. So communication has no stakes on how AI lands. When you think about it, all the other departments have a different agenda on it. Chief AI officer, IT looks at adoption velocity, brand is concerned about, marketing is concerned about brand, compliance worries about whether something's compliant, communication only cares about the coherence of that picture, whether that picture holds. So that independence, coupled by the function's horizontal role, meaning it shares surfaces with multiple departments, it has good connections within the business, that allows it the independent altitude needed. Any department who is driving AI adoption cannot mark their homework. So that would be, I think, the first unique value proposition communication brings. The second one, it is also the function that reads the internal signal as an external one. So what you say to your employees about AI adoption, and whether there's a gap between what you say internally and externally. And as we have seen increasing on the news, there's a lot of anger and fear and stigma when it comes to AI. AI itself has a bad reputation. So when you disclose your AI usage, its impact on environment, your own staff, governance, themselves are reputation indicators. And communication is the only department that's able to read all of those signals as reputation signals. So those are the unique values it can bring, but that seat is not going to be given. For that, you have to be able to demonstrate AI literacy. You can't govern a system you don't understand. So you need AI literacy, not necessarily enough to build, but enough to challenge governance and design decisions during the design phase, not after they fail.
Yeah. And I mean, we know that this is all changing at such a fast pace and developing very, very quickly. It's really hard to keep on top of it. So looking ahead 3 to 5 years, what do you think will separate communications leaders who thrive in the AI era and adapt from those who risk seeing their function gradually reduced to just an executional role?
So I would state two things. The first one is the basis of value for communication is changing. Reputation capital, editorial judgment, those are still important, but they should be considered as two signals within a wider set. As we discussed, you need all these new capabilities to be able to play the role that is expected of a communication leader today. So I think those that will thrive are going to be the ones who are able to deconstruct their value proposition, reconstruct it with what is needed, acquiring those capabilities, and to your point, do this exercise on the regular, because there is so much that we don't know about what AI does. So I think that lands me to my second thing, which is resilience in the face of ambiguity. The world is changing so fast, we don't even know what we don't know right now. So a lot of the times, you're going to have to change the engine while you're driving. So how resilient are you to operate in that ambiguity? I think that's the other trait is going to define whether a leader thrives or risks demotion in this era.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you. That was so interesting. I could go on even for another half hour, but we won't do that to our listeners. That brings us to the end of this episode of Human Machine Relations. A massive thank you to you, Elif, for joining me and sharing your thoughts on what AI means, not just for communications practice, but for the future role of the communications function itself. I highly recommend reading Elif's framework, The Two Clocks, a framework for the communications in the age of AI. If you enjoyed this and you want to hear more, make sure to follow Human Machine Relations on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Do you have a practical question or a specific topic that I haven't covered yet? Let me know in the comments. If I cover it, you might get a shout out in a future episode. Until next time, thanks for listening. And remember, the future isn't just about what machines can do, it's about how we choose to work with them. Bye-bye.